From compromising playoff competitiveness to imposing undue pressure on players, discover compelling reasons why the play-in tournament demands reconsideration. In this video, we explore why scrapping the play-in format might be essential for the integrity of the game and the well-being of the athletes. For starters, the playoffs seem less competitive now that the top 8 teams don't directly qualify. Does anyone remember how simple things used to be? Each team played their 82 games. The top 8 from each conference advanced to the playoffs, and one team finally came on top in the finals. What a world we used to live in. Unfortunately, COVID forced the NBA to change all that. And honestly, I can see why the league introduced the play-ins for the first time in 2020. After all, some teams ended up playing fewer games than others. So the play-ins were a novel way to keep things fair. That said, the fact that the play-ins have stuck around for so long is kind of strange to me. Like, now the top 6 head to the playoffs, and if you rank 7th or 8th, you have to compete with the 9th and 10th ranked teams to make it to the postseason games. There are a lot of problems with that. And one of the biggest is that the actual season games require an entirely different approach. Just think about it. Why would anyone care about reaching the top 8 if the top 10 will do just fine? There's not much of a point to reaching the top 8 anymore, because you're going to have to participate in the play-ins anyway. Sure, the top 6 spots are still pretty valuable, but at the same time, some teams can just rest their star players during the season because they know that they'll come in handy during the play-ins. A team with a mediocre record can get to the playoffs, whereas a team that outplayed them during the season will have to head home, all because of the outcome of a game they shouldn't have had to play. On the other hand, a few teams will do anything to get into the top 6, because the top 8 just won't cut it anymore. In a weird way, the season is somehow more competitive for no good reason, and that just takes the steam out of the playoffs. Before you start calling me a hater, let me just say that LeBron James himself hated the play-ins from the very start. He actually had some rather harsh words for whoever came up with the concept, and I totally get where he was coming from. During the 2021 season, the Lakers finished in 7th place, which should have guaranteed them a spot in the playoffs, but instead, they had to go up against the Warriors. The result? The Lakers beat their rivals and went to the playoffs, just like they would have anyway. But the Warriors weren't so lucky. The Grizzlies were able to score some extra points during overtime, and even though they were the 9th seed, they ended up in the playoffs, with the deserving 8th seed team ending up nowhere. Does that sound fair to you? To make things worse, this format might reduce the quality of the playoffs. There's a reason why the top 8 teams used to qualify. Simply put, it ensured that the playoffs would be as exciting as possible. But thanks to the new play-ins, a less skilled team could make it through pure luck. And as a result, the playoffs themselves won't be quite as gripping. This could potentially lead to lower fan turnout at games, and when you factor in how some teams might rest star players for the play-ins, that could take the lower turnout to a whole other level. You could say it's just the way the game is now, especially after the NBA decided that this whole thing was permanent. But this isn't the only issue with the play-in format. We have to address the toll that this will take on players. After a grueling season, 4 teams will need to tack a couple of additional games onto their calendar, and this will seriously increase the risk of injuries. You might think it's not a big deal, but each extra game puts additional strain on athletes, and the effect could compound when the actual playoffs begin. Not to mention, these players need a bit of downtime too. Even if we ignore the physical toll, the precious few days they get between the season and the playoffs help the players balance their personal lives. If they have to take part in the play-ins as well, that's less time to spend with their families. And that can cause mental health issues on top of everything else. The play-ins tossed into the mix are creating a recipe for burnout, which can further deteriorate the quality of the playoffs. It's a vicious cycle, really. Tired players can't compete to the best of their abilities. And if they're demotivated, they might not be able to bring their A-game to the play-ins. If, by some miracle, they keep the momentum going, that means they'll have less energy for the playoffs, and the effect could continue into the subsequent season as well. I haven't even talked about the logistical nightmares it can cause yet. Additional games will require more planning, with players forced to travel across the country for unexpected matchups. You have to understand that it's not just the games that'll tire the players out. All that travel will weigh on them sooner or later. And to put all that effort in despite being in the top 8 is unfair, to say the least. We've already seen plenty of examples of upsets in the play-ins that robbed deserving teams of a playoff spot. For example, The Cavaliers had a brilliant season in 2022 that saw them win 44 games. But thanks to Trae Young's performance in the play-ins, they lost their shot at the playoffs. I'll admit, Young was absolutely phenomenal in that matchup.
Trae Young floats it up and in for his second field goal.
But what about all the effort the Cavaliers put into their season performance? Shouldn't that count for something too? In my opinion, the play-ins make the stakes a lot higher than they need to be. They kind of seem more stressful than the playoffs, because in those crucial games, you can lose a couple times and still have a fighting chance. Whereas in the play-ins, 2 consecutive losses can dash your hopes of achieving greatness. Now, some might argue that these games are still exciting and that you can choose to just enjoy the extra basketball instead of complaining. I beg to differ. For one thing, just because the games are entertaining doesn't mean they make sense. Why stop at 20 teams? Why not up it to 24? Hell, why not make the entire NBA roster participate in a year-long postseason pre-playoff extravaganza? Okay, there are more arguments to be made in favor of the play-ins, like the fact that they even the odds and give lower-ranked teams a chance to shine. Some might even say that they democratize the league a bit, but that's a real stretch, if I'm being honest. If anything, they cheapen the playoffs, dilute the teams with the quantity over quality approach, and give below-par teams an advantage that blunts the game's edge in a big way. I'd be willing to give the NBA a pass if they had a good reason for keeping the play-ins. But the truth is, they're only doing it for money. Don't just take it from me. Evan Wash said as much himself. In case you don't know, he's the guy that probably deserves most of the credit for the play-ins. And to be more specific, he mentioned that the NBA saw a 25% rating bump because of the play-ins. He basically said that people wanted to see the conclusion to the Warriors' dramatic season, and the intrigue in the lead-up probably helped matters a lot. But that sounds like a terrible reason to keep the play-ins. There are better ways to gain more viewers, and ruining the exclusivity of the playoffs feels like a devil's bargain. In the end, my biggest concern is the unnecessary pressure this puts on players. To summarize, players now have to adjust their season-long performance to cater to the play-ins. That involves putting their bodies on the line, sacrificing time with their loved ones, and dealing with the extra travel on their schedule. Meanwhile, the NBA's top executives have dollar signs in their eyes, and they don't seem to care that a player of LeBron's stature and countless others absolutely despise the play-ins. So, what do you think? Are the play-ins worth the hassle, or should they be scrapped? We'll just have to wait and see what the NBA believes.
Allen flicks it ahead. Oh, flying!
But until then, due to the burden it adds to one player's shoulders and how it ruins the competitiveness of the playoffs, this was why the play-in tournament needs to be scrapped.